Hi, good morning. How are you? So, I'm here to discuss a very important topic today, something that's very important to me. I'm still answering your questions that are coming, mostly from readers who have read You Are the Universe, Discovering Your Cosmic Self and Why It Matters. The questions are sent to info@jayo.com. Once again, the questions are sent to info@jayo.com. info@jayo, JIYO.com. You can send me questions on any topic, although I enjoy those questions that have to do with the nature of reality more than anything else. And today I decided to take a number of questions and address them all in a single answer. So, by the way, you can also download the app jayo.com, which is our internet community for well-being, where we can hang out together so that we can reach a critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. So what I'd like to discuss today is something that keeps coming up, for me anyway, and has been a lifelong obsession for me, which is what is the nature of fundamental reality? And what is the answer to the question, who am I? I recently also have been reading a book by Michael Shermer called Heavens on Earth, which comes from what I call a naive perspective, the perspective that we call naive realism. And I'm going to have a conversation with Michael Shermer in New York later in January, where we can discuss these matters further. So let's start with our conversation today, our discussion, which is coming mostly from me to you. It's one-sided, and I should warn you that this is going to be a pretty exhaustive, detailed discussion, and you may not have the patience for it. And if you don't have the patience for it, then I'm just saying you may be wasting your time. And some of this stuff is pretty heavy, but there are people in the world who do want to know answers to the question, who am I? Why do I exist? Do I have a soul? What is the meaning of death? Does God exist? Etc., etc. And these questions require deep reflection. I have been reflecting on these matters all my life, and also have been practicing various forms of meditation and yoga nidra recently, which have brought some clarity to my own thinking. Okay, so let's first start with what I posed in the title of this talk. If everyday reality is a lucid dream, then all forms of realism could be false. So let me first define dream and also lucid dream. So dream is something that you've all experienced. Every night you go to sleep and there's a dream. And in the dream you see images, you see characters, you see locations. You mostly don't see yourself, but you see dream characters. But you're there in the dream as a dream character. And while you're dreaming, then it seems real. And when you wake up the next morning, then you kind of dismiss it as just a dream. Now, people who do dream work, and even neuroscientists, describe something called a lucid dream. And that lucid dream is a much more convincing dream, where it appears very, very real. People in lucid dreams can have erections and even have ejaculation, and their heart rate can speed up if it's a dangerous situation, and their blood pressure can go up, they can panic, on and on. But sooner or later, they have, if they practice lucid dreaming, and there are techniques to practice lucid dreaming, then you can wake up in the dream as the witnessing observer of the dream. And so you can have an inner knowing that you are dreaming, even though it's very convincing. Okay, now why do I say that everyday reality could be a lucid dream? One of my favorite quotes is, of course, from the German philosopher Wittgenstein, and he was a student, by the way, of Bertrand Russell. And one of my favorite quotes from Wittgenstein is, "We are asleep. Our life is a dream. We are asleep. Our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming." So I'll repeat Wittgenstein's statement. We are asleep. Our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. And what do we wake up to is the consciousness in which the dream is occurring. So that's Wittgenstein's quote. Now let's look at what we call everyday reality. So right now you're experiencing a perceptual reality. You're experiencing on your handheld device me with this shirt, sweater, painting, the shaman in the back, etc. This is a perceptual experience that is happening. It's the oning and offing of sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, sense perceptions in the form mainly right now of sound, of color, of shape, of form, which is basically raw visual experience. You're having the experience of seeing, you're having the experience of sound in the form of my language, and you're always also in daydreaming. You're thinking about what I'm saying. And of course there are other senses that you could be experiencing. If you're sitting on a chair, you could be aware of your buttocks sitting on the chair in the form of sensation. And if you're eating breakfast right now while you're watching this, you could be experiencing taste and smell. And all this is experience. All this is experience, and experience is the entanglement of sense perceptions, sensations, images, food, movements. All experience is the entanglement of sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, and sense perceptions. And that entanglement, in a sense, in your own awareness. Your consciousness is the field in which this entanglement is occurring as a modification of consciousness. But even if you don't buy into that, by tonight, everything that you experience today will be a dream. In fact, 5 minutes ago is already a dream. A minute ago is already a dream. A second ago is already a dream. So, in fact, no experience is graspable. It's evanescent. It arises and subsides eternally in what we call now, in the form of those entangled modifications of awareness. So, since experience is evanescent and ungraspable, and then it has a dreamlike quality, unless, of course, you're totally convinced by the nature of what people call objective reality, which is, of course, before we label it as objective reality, it's an experience in our own awareness. Moreover, it's an experience that once we start to really look at it very carefully, it's an ungraspable experience. It's arising and subsiding eternally in that which we call now. Now, here's another part of this argument, and that is that which you call me as the body-mind is also part of the dream, because you're experiencing your body-mind in the same way as you're experiencing this or that painting or that which is behind me, the statue. You're experiencing your body-mind in the same way as you're experiencing any perceptual object, or what we call a perceptual object. So your body-mind, which is the usual way we call ourselves, me and mine, is also part of the dream, because it's an experience, and it occurs in the same way as the experience of that painting or that shaman behind me, or the experience of me that you're having. It's in exactly the same way you're experiencing your body-mind, a modification of consciousness in the form of entangled sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. So that which we call I, me, mine is actually this body-mind, which is a dream character in the dream. You, as body-mind, are a dream character in the dream. I hope you understand that. And by tonight, everything that happened today will be a dream. Actually, everything that happened 5 minutes ago, a minute ago, a second ago is already a dream. So I've explained that enough times. But in order to go a little further in this whole idea, we need to address what philosophers call naive realism, representational realism, scientific realism, and how they relate to what we call epistemology and ontology. And if you have patience, and you can wait 15 seconds, then I'll come back to that. Okay? Only if you have patience. Oh, so I promised that I would now go into these different things that philosophers call naive realism, scientific realism, and representational realism, and something called instrumentalism. As I said, this was going to be heavy going, but if you want to understand the nature of reality, then you have to actually be patient and also know what others have thought about this. Okay, so now let me define naive realism, and I'm looking up references as I do this. So here's a definition of naive realism. In philosophy of mind, naive realism, also known as direct realism or common sense realism, is the idea that the senses provide us with direct awareness of objects as they really are. Objects obey the laws of physics and retain all their properties, whether or not there is anyone to observe them. They are composed of matter, occupy space, and have properties such as size, shape, texture, smell, taste, and color that are usually perceived correctly. In contrast, some forms of idealism claims that no world exists apart from the mind-dependent ideas, and some forms of skepticism say we cannot trust our senses. Naive realism is known as direct as against indirect or representative realism, which I'll talk about in a moment. But basically, the reason I think naive realism is false is that what we're calling reality in this case is dependent on a human nervous system or a human brain. So the human brain becomes the arbiter of reality. I would say that that could be true, but then there are realities experienced obviously by other species. What does the world look like to a bat that experiences reality through the echo of what we call ultrasound? What does the world look like to a dolphin or an underwater sea creature living in the depths of the ocean where there is no light? What does the world look like to an insect with multiple eyes? On and on. So we can see that there is no fixed picture of the world, only a species-specific experience of the world. So I would dispense with naive realism right there. And then I would say that most usual physicalist skeptics, atheists, etc., are basing all their arguments on naive realism. And I would actually say that they are naive skeptics. They're not radical skeptics because they take the physical world for granted. Okay, so we're done with naive realism. What is representational realism? Well, this is a very interesting branch of philosophy also. So let me read something from my notes that I have looked up. So representationalism, also known as representative realism or indirect realism, or epistemological dualism or representative theory of perception, is the philosophical position that the world we see in conscious experience is not the real world itself, but merely a miniature virtual reality replica of that world in an internal representation, say in the brain. Thus we know only our ideas or interpretations of objects in the world because a barrier or a veil of perception between the mind and the existing world prevents first-hand knowledge of anything beyond it. Unlike idealism, representationalism holds that our ideas come from sense data or images of a real material external world, but the immediate direct object of perception is only sense data that represents the external object. It approaches perception from a similar point of view to phenomenalism, also entails a type of dualism such as that of Descartes. Okay, so your brain creates a miniature picture of the world, which is a representation of a real world, but what that real world is, you have no access to. That's what we call representational realism. You can see that this theory, of course, which is concocted in consciousness, is a kind of a logical argument which says that the world is not as we perceive it. We perceive only a representation of it, and the real nature of the world, therefore, is veiled from us, but there is indeed a real world out there. Okay, so this is representational realism. Now we come to what is called instrumentalism. And I found a very good reference here by somebody who posted something called The Inquiring Mind, who is a physics and mathematics student, but also studies epistemology, metaphysics, astrophysics, and cosmology, and computational neuroscience, genetics, and evolutionary biology. And I found this very interesting, so I'm going to read it, okay? And the article is from the internet where I did my search, and it's called The Inquiring Mind, Realism versus Instrumentalism. A long philosophical debate, which is perhaps my most favorite topic, The author is Yara Mekhajerani. Yara Mekhajerani. So I'm reading now from him. A long philosophical debate, which is perhaps my most favorite topic in philosophy, is the issue of realism versus instrumentalism of science. I find this issue fascinating not only because my career is centered around science, but also because it effectively covers many essential principles of metaphysics and epistemology. Realism is the view that the theories of science and the entities they introduce really describe what actually exists in nature, which I've already discussed with you. In other words, based on scientific realism, atoms, electromagnetic waves, quantum phenomena, fundamental particles, and all other such entities really exist as long as the scientific theory is true, of course. Opposite to realism, there's anti-realism, which suggests these theories and entities do not correspond to the objective reality of entities in nature. On the contrary, scientific instrumentalism has a very different approach to the theories and entities introduced by science. Instrumentalism sees the focus of realism as irrelevant and instead suggests that science is an instrument. Very important, that science is an instrument. I've always said it's a method of inquiry, and it should be evaluated based on how good it can produce predictions and usable results. This is the view that I've come to support after much thinking. Before addressing the fundamental philosophical problem with realism, I want to explain a very concrete problem with the scientific method without going to existential and metaphysical discussions. Let's just examine the scientific method. It is explained in many shapes and forms, but without going into too much detail, the scientific method consists of identifying some problem, observation, inquiring, gathering data, forming a hypothesis, deducing the logical consequences of the hypothesis, and empirically testing those predictions, which then either confirm or disprove the hypothesis after many trials and ideally numerous predictions. It is immediately obvious that science inherently depends on logic and human reasoning. The connection between a testable prediction and a theory is entirely based on reasoning alone. For example, electromagnetic waves are a conceptual entity. One cannot test the existence of an abstract entity. Instead, human reasoning is used to connect that idea to a testable prediction. Even if one accepts that there is no objective reality, it is not determined whether our reasoning connects the right theory to the right prediction. But I must admit that I'm not entirely confident on this issue because it can be argued that logic itself is an empirical science. But when was the last time you empirically tested a theorem in your mathematics class? Whatever that means. The issue of the origin of logic is an interesting one, which I like to pursue further. But as far as I can tell, mathematics does not seem empirical to me. Thus, the whole scientific method as a means of discovering some objective reality of nature breaks down. However, I find a deeper problem with the realistic point of view, and this is more of a metaphysical approach. In order to attempt to find out whether science corresponds to reality, we must clearly define what we mean when we ask whether an entity exists or entities exist. One can define existence based on perception or based on reasoning. In other words, I can define existence such that something exists if I perceive it, or it exists if I think it. So let's backtrack a little and see what it is we are trying to answer and thus come up with a good definition. I want to find out whether scientific entities correspond to the outer world that I experience around me. So what is the outer world? Let's start from what I know. I know that I am some conscious agent. This is all I know. Next, I observe a world around me. Of course, what I observe does not necessarily exist in the sense that I do as a conscious agent. All of this world, including other seemingly conscious agents, are all in my perception and can be anything, an illusion, a dream, a virtual reality, etc. Now, I do not have access to anything outside of my perception, so I define knowledge within my perception. So at first it seems that a good definition for existence is direct perception. However, it quickly becomes obvious that the world around me is not what I directly observe it to be. For example, 5 years ago, something funny happened. The universe got fuzzy, and so I started wearing glasses so I can operate better in the transformed fuzzy universe. But my reasoning tells me that the universe did not change, but it was my eyes, my perception that changed, and that belief shapes my belief shapes my reality. Another example is what we call optical illusions. In the case of observation, but again from reasoning and observation together, we know that there are optical illusions. The point is that in constructing my reality, perception and reasoning are inseparable. So ultimately, I am a conscious agent, and the reality around me is a reality constructed in my mind through my perception and reasoning. With this definition of reality, how does science correspond to reality? The answer is that science creates reality. When I see the effects of atoms under the microscope, my perception and reasoning create a new reality. This is exactly analogous to the examples I gave earlier. Therefore, any scientific theory becomes a new reality, and the realism, anti-realism debate becomes completely meaningless. Instead, the focus of science becomes the evaluation of different versions of reality based on their usefulness. The new realities of atoms, electromagnetism, and quantum mechanics, along with all other successful theories, are indeed more superior to their alternatives, so far at least, in the sense that they have been the most useful in making a consistent, predictable, and harvestable reality. But then this is the last part of the sentence, for the reasoning and perception that created them. For the reasoning and perception that created them. So I'll repeat this, okay? The new realities of atoms, electromagnetism, and quantum mechanics, along with other successful theories, are indeed more superior to their alternatives in the sense that they have been the most useful in making a consistent, predictable, and harvestable reality for the reasoning and the perception that created them. So what is the reasoning and perception that created them? Where is that happening? Where is that happening? So see here, we have to go back to the reasoning and the perception that created them can only be happening in consciousness. Can only be happening in consciousness. And as soon as, of course, we realize that, then we realize that the common thread in all experience, in all reasoning, is consciousness. That's the only consistent, that which we call I. But here's a very important point. The body-mind is not the container of awareness. The body-mind is an experience in awareness. And it is experienced as the same way as everything else. And as such, it's an evanescent experience. And so it's part of the dream. You're a dream character in the dream. Okay, so I think if you followed me thus far, and if you have not been impatient, then you'll realize that all forms of realism actually fall apart because they are theories in consciousness, conceived in consciousness, subject to reason without explaining what reason is, what logic is, what is the source of thought. You know, I asked my friend Michael Shermer a while ago, so what is a thought? And he said, it's an electrochemical reaction here. And he pointed to his brain. And my objection to that is that statement itself is then a thought, right? A thought, about a thought. This is an electrochemical reaction here, is a thought about a thought. So is the electrochemical activity creating an existential statement about itself? That sounds pretty bizarre, right? So these are the conundrums that you fall in, whether you believe in any form of realism. Instrumentalism, what is called scientific realism, which is basically the view that the universe described by science is real regardless of how it may be interpreted. And I find that argument also kind of weak. Within philosophy of science, it is often an answer to the question, scientific realism that is, how is the success of science to be explained? The discussion on the success of science in this context centers primarily on the status of unobservable entities, such as atoms, electromagnetic fields, and that are talked about by scientific theories. So scientific realism has the same ontological status as observables, but observables, as the word implies, is in itself saying that there is an observer. You can't get rid of this observer, right? So what is the observer if not consciousness? So now let's end this discussion a little bit by going into, just a couple of scientific definitions that you need to understand in order to complete what I'm saying. So one is called epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy that investigates the origin, nature, and methods of knowledge. So it's obvious that the human capacity is dependent, even if you're a realist, on the ability of your brain to grasp reality. But is reality something that the brain is exploring? Are there limits to what the brain can tell us? So epistemology questions our ability with the human brain to totally understand that which we call reality. And it's very closely related to that which we call ontology, which is the branch of metaphysics that studies the nature of existence or being. What is it that is the fundamental reality? And then metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that treats of first principles. So metaphysics looks at first principles. It includes ontology and cosmology. It looks at the origins of what we call space-time and causality. But remember, these are all activities in consciousness. Consciousness conceives, constructs, governs, and then becomes the realities that it conceives of. Now, here's my final argument. If everyday reality, including the reality of the body-mind, is a dream projected by consciousness, and if consciousness is a formless domain of infinite possibilities, then what prevents consciousness from projecting other dreams, heavens, hells, purgatories, other universes? Now, it's very interesting that science is getting there, because if you look at the latest theories of science, they include, including, what my friend Leonard Mallard, now co-author with Stephen Hawking of Grand Design, proposed 10 to the power of 500 universes based on something called M theory. There are other mathematicians like Max Tegmark in MIT who say there are infinite universes based on mathematics. And of course there's multi-worlds theory, there's multi-universe theory, They're all based on mathematics, which is an activity totally in consciousness. Other people like Eugene Wigner have said, questioned why is mathematics so unreasonable in predicting what we find in physics, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. No one had, Max Tegmark is the name, Tegmark. You can look up all these people. Okay, so it seems like scientific realism is actually giving us an answer very similar to mythological stories like the Yoga Vishishta. Infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness, like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light. So this everyday reality, including this body-mind, is a dream, evanescent, ungraspable. So are the others. What is then the real reality? The real reality is that which is dreaming it all. And that real reality is not the body-mind, is not the so-called physical world, which is just a perceptual experience. And what we call matter is the interpretation of those perceptual experiences. So what is the real reality is the consciousness that can dream up these different realities. Currently, we are all sharing a lucid dream that we call the physical world. And navigating this lucid dream with scientific realism and instrumentalism, we have included in that dream things like the moon, the sun, the stars, Mars, etc. We can send dream characters like human body minds in spaceships, which are also dream objects, to the moon, another dream object. We can send a rover to Mars, a dream object to a dream object called Mars. But you will be bamboozled by the superstition of matter if you don't realize that it is consciousness that matters. Consciousness that matters. I'm using matters here as a verb. Consciousness appears as that which we call matter. But matter is part of our shared lucid dream. It's an interpretation of perceptual experiences. So, my friends, why bother knowing this? And, if you want to be a biological robot, if you want to just go through life in a dreamlike state and be convinced that that is reality, then that doesn't matter. But at the end of your life, you will have lived an unexamined life, which is, as has been said, not worth living. The examined life should include questions like, what is logic? What is reason? What is a thought? What is consciousness? What is the nature of fundamental reality? What are the limitations of the human mind to know? And is not life and death the same thing? And I've said before that death is not the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of birth. Birth and death are opposites, and life is the continuum of birth and death. Life is the recycling of consciousness as forms, phenomena, and experiences. Where does the individual fit in this? The individual is a conscious agent that has created its own interpretations of reality and then manifests as a dream-like body-mind in a dream-like body world. The conscious agent itself is a drop in the vast ocean of consciousness that is manifesting the dream it has chosen. You and I are conscious agents. And consciousness agents are not in space-time because space-time is part of the dream. So I have gone on now for over 40 minutes, and I may have exhausted your patience right now, so I apologize for that. But come back to this video, analyze it, argue for or against, and let us continue this conversation on fundamental reality. Okay? Thank you for being part of my dream, though. So interesting that we are in each other's dream right this moment. Thank you.